Okay, so thank you very much again, Nathan, for having
Yeah,
accepted the invitation.
thank you
I'm
for the
really pleased
invitation.
to talk to you.
Yeah.
And so I have a very brief introductory note about you, and then we
Hmm.
will start with the questions. You can correct me if something is missing
Okay.
or something is updated. And so Nathan Widder is professor of political theory in Department of Politics, International Relations and Philosophy in
Yep.
Royal Holloway University of London. He has done research and published widely on questions of difference, pluralism, power, identity, and knowledge. He has authored three major books, Genealogies of Difference in 2002, Reflections on Time and Politics, 2008, and Political Theory after Deleuze,
Those. Yeah.
2012, that we are going
Yeah.
to discuss basically today. So I hope it was updated. Or
Yes.
you have written meanwhile something new. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I've got this. I'm a conclusion and an introduction away from a long monograph on the development of the concept of sense in Deleuze's
Oh,
philosophy from the 1950s up through the logic of
oh,
sense.
wonderful.
Yeah.
You also have devoted a chapter on the question of sense in this book, but
Yes.
yeah. So now my first question is that one of the key themes of your research is a relationship between Deleuze philosophy and the concept of micropolitics.
Yes.
What brought you generally? What brought you to Deleuze, and what makes him special for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that goes back to my earlier education. So I did my undergraduate. I'm from the United States originally. I did my undergraduate degree at Johns Hopkins University, where I studied political theory with William Connolly. If you know the name, it's a very important English speaking English language American political theorist, who's basically in many ways responsible for introducing first Nietzsche and Foucault and then later Deleuze into a lot of American political theory debates. And so I was studying there, and that's where I got my introduction to thinkers like Nietzsche and Foucault. And Connolly himself was just starting to read Deleuze when I was still there as an undergraduate, and I actually had the opportunity to take some graduate courses with him, where he was introducing Deleuze to his PhD students, and that was my initial exposure. I then moved to the UK. I did a master's at the London School of Economics, which was featured one really interesting Cambridge historian of political ideas named Janet Coleman, and then a number of Oakeshottians and some liberals. And I refer to this as my year of self-imposed purgatory before I did my PhD with Ernesto Laclau. And Deleuze was this figure from my undergraduate years who I was interested in, and didn't know very much about him. I couldn't understand it in any great detail when I was reading it as an undergraduate, but I started to read it more near the end of my master's and into my PhD, and it became a figure that, and the program that I was in was quite dominated by people interested in Hegel, Heidegger, Husserl, not really Husserl, Hegel, Heidegger, Lacan, and Derrida. And so in a way it was a bit strategic that Deleuze was a figure that I could kind of develop my own reading of. It wouldn't really be influenced by the people I was studying with. It kind of helped me draw out my own path. And what I was doing my PhD in was a project on which became Genealogies of Difference. It was a project looking at conceptions of difference and identity in ancient and medieval philosophy. And Deleuze was also just starting to be widely read, more and more read in the English-speaking world. And so Difference and Repetition was only translated in 1994, Logic of Sense in 1990. And it actually really helped me in its own quirky way understand the history of philosophy. So I kind of figured out really important things about Aristotle by reading Deleuze, and really important things about Deleuze by reading Aristotle, and later, Duns Scotus and others. So it just became that, and this was also a time, we didn't have Web 2.0 yet. We didn't have blogs. We had email lists. So in the 1990s, there were these email lists where conversations would be started. It was a Spoons Collective lists. And they had a Deleuze and Guattari email group. They had a Nietzsche group that I was also involved in. And usually you kind of quickly discovered you were the one person interested in Deleuze in your department, and there was some other PhD student on the other side of the world who was interested in it as well. I mean, they're non-academics as well, but a lot of PhD students. We all kind of met through that list, and in many ways, certainly for me, that was a really useful way of developing my ideas. I used to write 3 or 4, 5-paragraph emails about something to the Deleuze and Guattari list, or respond to something with a 3 or 4 or 5-paragraph email. And some of those became actual publications later on. I worked them up. So yeah, he became that kind of a figure. And I mean, I was already quite influenced by Foucault and by these debates that I'd already been trained in, which had to do with kind of identity and post-identity politics. And the micropolitics stuff in Deleuze really fit in well with that. It fit in so well with, Foucault's discussions about biopower and biopolitics, and these kinds of, strains in Nietzsche that were being taken up as well in political theory around, kind of rethinking the nature of the self and subjectivity and stuff. So all of those things kind of converge. And although my first book was on, like I say, these conceptions of difference in ancient and medieval philosophy, also put it into relationship with Hegelian and post-Hegelian debates about identity and difference. Like that, those kinds of questions were already there, and they continued. They continued in my second book, my third book.
Great. Nathan, right in the beginning of the book, in the preface of the book, you say that in order to sum up your project, you believe that micropolitical is we are micropolitical before we're political, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I should give a thanks to Jane Bennett, another political theorist at Johns Hopkins. She wasn't at Hopkins when I was there, but was at another local university, Goucher College. Because she was the one who suggested that when I was explaining the book project, to her, you're micropolitical before you're political. And yeah, I think that became a good organizing thesis for the book itself. Yeah, if I can go back to reference Foucault before this, Foucault has these essays on the Iranian Revolution, and his quite controversial. I mean, he's subject to a lot of criticisms, some of which I just don't think people read what he had to say about what interested him about the revolution. But there's one piece, it's called Spirit of a World Without Spirit. I think that's the subtitle. It's an exchange that he has with several other journalists who had been in Iran and were covering it. And I can't remember, but I think it's Foucault who makes this point, that he was talking to somebody who said, we all knew that there was this political project, we had to get rid of the Shah, but we knew that before we had to change our society, we had to change ourselves. And that's what I think the connection is. If that's also the thesis in Deleuze and Guattari, that because revolutionary action, or any action, is a matter of desire, we first have to change our desire and therefore change ourselves in whatever kinds of politics we have. So I mean, a quite standard traditional approach to politics in any kind of undergraduate degree, in any kind of Sunday afternoon, Sunday morning talk show in television in the West, politics is this institutional thing. It's this public thing. It's about elections. It's about institutions of government where various representatives of different constituencies kind of hammer out their differences, and they exercise a lot of power in doing it, or not, depending on their power position in these institutions. They're not supposed to, according to the ideal of it. But that's a very kind of limited notion of what politics is. It's still the case, I think, with a lot of political theory, that's kind of the starting point for the way we understand politics. And I think one of the important things that came out of all the introduction of Nietzsche and Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and others into these academic debates, certainly, and elsewhere as well, because they have a broader reach than the academy. It's just this idea that, you know, politics is more nuanced than that. It involves more domains than that. I mean, you know, the personal is political, so that you know, it reflects, you know, other things, feminist political theory, for example. And yeah, the starting point of our politics shouldn't be the terrain of the institutions and the seemingly already established constituencies, but, you know, how it is that these constituencies come about, right? And how it is that they form, how it is that they can become effective, how it is that they fail to be effective, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
I quote from you, Nathan, in a part of the book. We have the political and social lives and values that we ought to have given the micropolitics that constitutes us. And if we wish to move beyond what it is at its most spiteful, vindictive, and reactionary, we must begin here. End of quote. It's also from the preface to the book. What's malicious or spiteful? Could you please explain that?
Oh, malicious or spiteful. Well, that's a little bit, I mean, the way that's a reference to two things, I should say. The reference to one is the very first page of Deleuze's book on Nietzsche. He says that we each have the beliefs, values, and something else, maybe it's desires, that we ought to have given our way of being and our style of life. It's this whole idea that, you know, our values are based on these evaluations. These evaluations really reflect our perspectives, and we always have the values that we have based on our perspective on the world. So, you know, some of our perspectives are those of the base. Nietzsche refers to frog perspectives and beyond good and evil, the frog looking up versus the eagle looking down. So there's things like that. And so it's a nod to that, and it's also a reference to that. It's also just a reference more generally to Nietzsche, what his thesis is about rhizastance. So, and that was one of the first ways in which I was introduced to Nietzsche in political theory debates, was that, you know, Nietzsche's now more and more taught in political theory. He has an academic status he didn't have 30, 40, 50 years ago. But what he you know, he's not a political thinker in a quite traditional sense of a thinker who has a theory of sovereignty and how the legislature and executive and judicial powers relate. You know, he's not a Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau or John Stuart Mill or John Rawls or any of those types. But he has a political point, which is that our politics have up to this point been thoroughly grounded in rhizastance about others, rhizastance about ourselves, rhizastance about the human condition. For Nietzsche, it says we live in a world which has no divine purposes. It has no purposes at all, and much of our social lives, our political lives, our personal lives are based on a resentment about that fact. We suffer and we don't know why, and in part it's because there is no why. There's no answer to that question. Even though we seek it, we blame others for it. All of those kinds of things. So Nietzsche talks about it in terms of the pettiness of our politics and the pettiness of the politics of his day, but you can see how it today as well, I think. So it again gets to, if we're going to change that, we need to change ourselves, right?
Great. One of the authors that you drew upon in the book is, if I'm not wrong, Stephen White, and his concept of strong and weak ontology. Ontology, according to him, is a philosophical position that emphasizes the reality of pre-existing objective world that exists independently of human subjectivity. And in contrast, weak ontology emphasizes a contingency and multiplicity. I would be thankful to you, Nathan, if you could make this difference a bit more clear for us.
Yeah. So again, I mean, that book that's quite a book. It's a kind of it's White's kind of summary of the political theory debates, really, that I grew up with, the ones I'm telling you about as an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins. So William Connolly there's a chapter devoted to his thought in that book, as well as Charles Taylor, Judith Butler, and George Caton. So I mean that White is writing that book, kind of summarizing what he sees as these debates that have developed kind of in response to the liberalism of John Rawls, that was very dominant in the 70s and the 80s, much of which is related to Nietzsche and Foucault and later Deleuze, although the kind of stuff he's talking about is not really kind of focused on that period of William Connolly's work when Deleuze was more influential. But the idea is that what very kind of standard old style classical political theory was it was ontologically heavy. It had a theory of human nature, or it had a theory of, you know, the moral good, the objective moral good, and so forth. And then a lot of that gets wiped away in, again, these, you have to say, they're Anglo-American debates. They're quite particularly American debates, from the likes of, you know, John Rawls and kind of liberalism more generally. Isaiah Berlin is British, Russian emigre British, isn't he? If I'm correct. You can edit that out if I've got Berlin's biography wrong, can't you? But he those are ones that say, well, because, you know, the starting point of those is that all of these kind of ontological understandings about human nature, about the good, they're religious and metaphysical, and we should just get rid of them. Liberalism's kind of starting point is we don't know what the good is. It's for everybody to figure it out. We should have a society of freedom, maximum, if possible, freedom for everyone to figure out what their own good is. And, you know, that itself was subject to critiques in the 1980s for resting upon a whole number of metaphysical and ontological claims about human nature, even if they seemed to be minimal claims. They were actually quite strong claims, because they're based on a kind of individualist approach, you know, kind of shaving away of the relation between the individual and the group and so forth. So what White tries to say is that's going on with these thinkers in the 80s and 90s, who are in many ways are looking at Hegel and Nietzsche and Foucault and Derrida and others, is that they're not returning to this kind of strong ontology where they think that there are objective truths, but nor are they saying that there's no importance to ontology. And what they're doing is they have this kind of weak ontology where their political theories are based on ontological claims about the nature of language and the self, and the individual and the group and so forth. But they're put forward with a kind of reserve and modesty, right? You know, again, William Connolly is like a key figure in that, because his kind of way of doing this in the 1980s, at least, was to refer to these kinds of onto-political commitments that kind of put forward, in a certain sense, ironically, they're not meant to be like truth claims, but they're valuable claims for thinking, and maybe just for thinking in alternative ways. And so what the book tried to do, my book, the Deleuze book, was to say, well, Deleuze wasn't either of these. He's a strong thinker in the sense of he makes like quite strong ontological claims about the nature of the self and so forth. But to support a kind of pluralism and ethics and politics that's usually associated with this kind of weak ontology. So what he does in many respects is he provides these kind of strong ontological conditions for a certain kind of politics that whether you want to call it anti-liberal or post-liberal or doing something other than kind of standard politics, kind of well, it's post-identity politics. That might be the best way of putting it. A kind of strong ontological claim for why you should have a post-identity politics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Great. Again, I have a quote from you, an ontology of sense. I mean,
yes.
you're writing about sense, and it might be more interesting, at least for me, for us. And you've devoted a whole chapter to the question of sense and ontology of sense. I quote you: an ontology of sense does not affirm the being of appearances against that of essence.
Right.
As one side of an opposition, appearance presuppose essence hidden behind or beneath it, as when it is said that underneath a thing's appearance is the thing in itself, or the thing as it really or essentially is. So an ontology of sense, on the contrary, denies this division, and if denies the division of any foundational status, and holds instead that appearances such as they exist present only the illusion of essences lying underneath them, when in fact there is nothing underneath, end of quote. So
what does that mean?
Right. I mean, Deleuze, I know a whole chapter, perhaps, I don't know, perhaps like 40 pages you have written on that. I know it's not easy to summarize that. But, once I was writing on humor, the fascinating thing to make use of Deleuze for me was that Deleuze is one of these really unique thinkers that sort of not only deconstructs this binary opposition between appearance and essence, but gives you the tool. And so humor can be one of those tools to say that, look, there is nothing behind that. I mean, it is a surface. We are moving on the surface. So that's why it was interesting for me. The whole chapter was interesting for me and relevant, actually. And again, I would be happy to hear more on that.
I mean, it's a thesis. It comes from the early Deleuze. It comes from Deleuze's reading of his teacher Hippolyte, John Hippolyte's reading of Hegel, because Hippolyte introduces this idea of Hegel as a thinker, not of essence but of sense, and that idea that there's nothing behind the curtain, that's Hegel. It's Hegel's conclusion, for example, somewhere near the end of the third chapter of the Phenomenology. Behind the curtain, there's nothing to see. So all there is the presentation. The presentation is the essence. Slavoj Žižek, who I will almost never say a complimentary thing about, in terms of his work, but the sublime object of ideology picks up on that idea as well. It's the idea that, behind the curtain there's nothing, that the essence is the appearance, that there's nothing behind the appearance, that's the hidden essence. And Nietzsche actually has some interesting ones, kind of accounts of this too, which I've drawn on, I don't think in the book, but certainly in my second book. If you know, in The Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche has this little 1.5 page or so summary of the history of truth as an error. We start with the true world as this kind of Platonic world of ideas, and at some point that gets dragged down to the true world doesn't exist anymore. That essential world behind this world of phenomena doesn't exist. So let's get rid of it. But the problem is, if we get rid of the world of essence, we get rid of the world of appearance as well, because they were defined by each other. And that's just kind of the moment, the incipit Zarathustra, the end of the longest era, etc. There's something else that Nietzsche says, I think it's in the World of Power notes, where he talks about there is a world of appearance, but it's not our world of appearance. It's not our world of the appearance, which has an essence behind it, but it's a kind of chaos of sensations that's unknowable to us, because ultimately that is our condition, is that we're in a world of surfaces and of appearances without an essence behind them. That's just the chaos of sensations, which are kind of operating below the level of consciousness, I suppose you could say. So the level of drives, the level of forces, so forth. Which I realize reintroduces that spatial notion, because the below or behind consciousness. But there you go. It's still not meant to be an essential world behind that. So, again, Deleuze starts with this Hegelian, Hippolytean idea that there's no world behind, there's no true world behind the world as it's given to us. And we have to therefore understand this world, what is given to us, in a different way. Not that there's some truth hidden or otherwise behind it, but that it's the world of, that's a good way of putting it. Well, in the Nietzsche book, it's of forces. In Anti-Oedipus, it's a world of desires. In Foucault, it'd be a world of power relations and so forth, which give a kind of appearance of, right? It's a world of forces which give the kind of appearance of essences to them, essences, identities, and so forth. World of differences that gives rise to the appearance of stabilities that are real, but only insofar as they're appearances of stability. They're not ontologically foundational stabilities. And yeah, I don't know if I've confused you more. Confused anyone listening?
No.
Confused you more. But I think that's the starting. That's kind of the starting point. We have to stop thinking of things in terms of essences that then relate, essences that then are different from each other. We have to start thinking of things that are differences, a world of differences from which what seem to be essences emerge later on.
Right.
And they have a reality to them because they appear to us, but it's the reality of perspectival illusions. I think that's probably the best way of putting it.
There are different, I mean, interestingly, in the beginning of the book and towards the end of the book, you talk about identity.
Yeah.
And you address identity and identity politics in a sense in different parts of the book. So talking about identity and Deleuze's view on that, you believe that, I'm quoting you, for Deleuze, there is a productivity at this level that is not that of an identity generated through exclusion. So if identity is not made through exclusion, then through which other mechanism it is made?
Yeah, that's the perspectival illusion bits. So maybe this is a good chance to go back to the other side of my personal genealogy. So like I said, I did my PhD with Ernesto Laclau at Essex. I don't know if you know about Laclau's political theory. I mean, it was quite Hegemony and Socialist Strategy that he wrote with Chantal Mouffe, a very seminal kind of text that introduces post-Marxism by way of kind of taking a Marxist lineage that kind of goes through Althusser and Gramsci and adding to it Derrida, some Wittgenstein, some Lacan, and others. To say that a new kind of politics of the left has to get rid of the old essentialisms, right? The old essentialisms are the economy is the determinant in the final instance. There's a base and superstructure, and that there are objective class interests, objective identities, right? Group identities, and so a lot of Laclau's thinking was concerned with the ways in which identities are constituted, precisely because they're not pre-given, they're not objective. And he adopts something in other kinds of ways Zizek does, in other kinds of ways Judith Butler does. Identities are based on exclusions. So it's this kind of firming up of the boundaries of an identity, be it an individual or collective identity. An individual identity borrows from collective terms anyway. So I don't think there's a fundamental difference there. The creation of an us and a them, right, ultimately involves some kind of barrier or border that separates the two of them. And so that's the exclusion. It's constitutive because there's no us or them without the separation. But it's also problematic because we require them for there to be an us, right, and so forth. I think that kind of, in Laclau's own work, that becomes this kind of, these kind of collective identities have to be established. They're always problematic, but politics couldn't function without them. And what it leads to is a certain kind of politics, which, in a way, Chantal Mouffe says it better, has said it more clearly, is ultimately a politics of antagonism. In other words, and this is where Schmitt later comes in, particularly in Mouffe's work rather than Laclau's, although I think Laclau talked about Schmidt as well. Politics requires the friend-enemy distinction, and that's kind of the starting point of the politics, is to establish it. So that works well for a certain point in politics. Even Gramsci noted it worked well, but maybe wasn't sustainable over a long term. But that's kind of the way in which their politics begins. And I suppose, like, even being part of that program, there's always some little bit of me which thought that was wrong. Foucault has a comment he makes in an interview he has. It's in the text Remarks on Marx. It's an interview he has with set of interviews he has with Guccio Trombadori, an Italian Marxist, and he says, this whole talk of friends and enemies, I think, is an intolerable way of doing politics. Because if you really think, like, whether it's seen to be ideological or rhetorical or what have you, as soon as you have in a position of power, how would you treat this person or this group that you've constituted as your enemy in the name of establishing your own identity? Would lead to tyranny. So yeah, I think that gets to exactly the kind of politics Deleuze doesn't have time for, Foucault doesn't have time for, and is very much an identity-oriented politics. The first thing we have to do is find our enemy as a condition for us to have our own collective. And so, I mean, and that's why I think part of the micropolitics and Deleuze's terms, the care of the self, and Foucault's, a lot of this is about kind of overcoming that predilection, maybe that tendency towards enemy creation, towards friend-enemy binaries. So then we get to, well, what is the identity bit in all of this? If identities aren't formed like really through exclusions, what are they formed from? And I always say that they're perspectival illusions. I think that is the point that Nietzsche is making when he talks about the subject and the self as being fictions. I think it's what Deleuze is talking about. Perspectives have a truth to them because they have, in some ways, they even have an objectivity to them, even if they're false. And I think a good way of a good example of it, which I think is in Spinoza, and I think it's also in Kant, maybe it's in Hume, but it's in one or more of those three, is from the perspective of standing on the surface of the earth, looking up in the sky, the sun and the moon look like they're the same size. And that doesn't mean they really are the same size, but it means it really is the case that they look that way, and they can't look otherwise from this perspective. And in a way, because everything comes from a frame of reference, the sun and the moon will always look whatever size they look. There's never a neutral frame of reference from which you get like the objective size relation between them. It's always from some frame of reference that you're measuring them. So they look a certain way from our perspective, and again, that becomes the perspectives form the starting points for the way we think about all of these things, right? Whatever we are is in all of our diversity as human cultures, surely a lot of it comes from the fact that we look up at the sky, or our ancestors did, and it looks like the sun and the moon are the same size. It looks like everything is revolving around the earth, right? It looks like we are the center. If you get outside of a city and you look up at the sky, it looks like a real dome, right? With holes that are punched in it, and light seems to shine through it. Like all of these kind of ancient, conceptions of what the cosmos is, they're based on what it really looks like, right? Even if they're not necessarily true, because the earth goes around the sun and so forth. I suppose from a certain perspective and a certain frame of reference. So anyway, there's this notion of these perspectival illusions, and I think those things, when to answer your question about identity itself, like another thing I like to talk about. I don't think I use this one in the book, but everyone is always changing, right? We're not the same people that we were when this conversation began. Our being towards death, if you want to use Heidegger, we're a little bit closer to it now than we were, whatever it is, 25 minutes ago. More of our past is kind of embedded in our present, if you want to use Bergson, something else. you're not the same person. We aren't the same people we were a year ago or 10 years ago, so forth. There's something I always Google, you get a different answer every time you Google. It's something every 7 years, what is it, like all the cells in your body are replaced, or all the material in your brain is replaced, or all your brain is entirely rewired. Something about 7 years. But we nevertheless have a sense of a continuity of ourselves, like it was the same person 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's not true, except insofar as it is. There can be real stabilities in ourselves and in a group as well over time. So if your mom tells you, well, you were always this way, you always had a short temper, you always had a kind of sense of sarcasm, you're always a bit of a smart aleck, you're always something else, since you were a little kid, that might be true, right? But it can't be for the same reasons, because you're not the same person you were as a kid. So there's a way in which, through our becoming and through our change over time, certain stabilities are retained. And so there is a real sense in which we are the same. We call this, people will call this your character, right? That your long-term character, what makes you what you are. But again, it has to be seen in this way of thinking as the effects of the way in which, as a result of the way in which we change, as opposed to a stability that's always there through our change. And I think that's what I mean to say identities are illusory.
Nathan, I mean, just talking about identity, I had an example of, I mean, we can be as critical as possible of such concepts like identity when you're talking and thinking about them as abstract terms. But just let's imagine a refugee coming to Europe from Afghanistan. And who really aims to embrace the micropolitics of living here. But is constantly surrounded by a host who is defending, if not imposing, his identity.
What is worse than that in the UK, if you've been following the news,
right?
So okay, but yeah, sorry. Yeah, if only they were just defending and imposing. But sorry, go on.
Yeah. I mean, like in that sense, I can imagine that the refugee, would also start, of course, in a reactionary way to defend his or her identity. But I mean, what would you do in that scenario?
Possibly,
when you're actually supposed to assimilate yourself, to be integrated in that sense,
What would I do? Well, God, that's a hard one. That's a hypothetical. I should take the standard politician's answer. I won't answer a hypothetical. I think I take your point. I think here's the things I'd say. I mean, the fact that those materials exist, which is also part of our social world, these kind of categories and terms, as well as, we all have our pasts, we all have our cultures, we all have our places we've come from. And so therefore we also have our various terms of reference, which we can hold on to in different ways or give up in different ways and so forth. I think whether it's an individual, how do they assimilate or hold on to themselves, or a collective. I mean, I think I wouldn't deny that that's a description of what a lot of politics really is. I think one of the points is that, and maybe this is quite idealistic, like, is that the way it has to be? I suppose. I mean, from either side or from both sides. The more idealistic side of this is and it's often dismissed as naive, as celebration of differences or something like that. And I mean, differences exist. I think that's probably the starting point of this, and they can be celebrated or they could be diminished. And they can be used in a way that creates a more pluralistic kind of sense of things, or they can be, reactionary, I suppose. That's probably a bit of an abstract answer. It's not really an answer. What would I do in this situation? I probably feel displaced.
Right.
at a very
Right.
fundamental level. I wouldn't deny, and that's not to deny like that those really exist either. The question is what are you displaced from? And maybe I think the one thing I would try to avoid saying is that the Afghan person, the refugee from wherever that person is from, is displaced from what they really were, right? From a true self, from a true collective identity they belong to, and so forth. I think a good way of thinking about it is we're all hybrid. Wherever we're from, we're hybrid. We face a politics that denies that all the time. A nativist politics will deny that all the time. But we're all hybrid, even if we want to forget. And if something happens that seems to disrupt us, that seems to make us feel like we've lost something, it's not. It's a hybridity that it's a change from one hybridity to another, right? Yeah, I think that's the thing. That's the thing I would want to kind of keep.
Right.
But what
right.
you describe is a real is a genuine situation.
That's somehow like my day-to-day experience. I mean, not that perhaps personally all the time, but I mean, let's go back to I mean, let's say my concern here is again, to what extent can we stick to micropolitics? And the question is for me here that, I mean, can we maintain a micropolitical view of life or way of life without taking into account the molar or macropolitical role and ignoring the power of the rigid international organization, rich banks, warmongers, apartheid regimes, and those who can overnight impose new sanctions on other countries?
I would say if we could maintain it, it wouldn't be a very admirable thing to do, because probably the only way you can maintain it is to just distance yourself from all of. I'm sure somebody has the means to do it, but the material means to do it. But the answer is going to no. But I also don't think that that's what this means. I mean, I would not take the view that this interest in the micropolitical or stressing the importance of it means that there aren't these other forms of there aren't these other domains of politics. I mean, it's called micropolitical rather than just political, because there's obviously other forms of there's also obviously other domains or other levels of politics, and yeah, all of those things are they're tied together. I mean, I suppose it gets back to your opening question, like why are we micropolitical before we're political? It's not because those other politics are unimportant. It's that the starting point for how we consider engaging those ought to be micropolitical, right? Even if they don't end there.
Right.
I mean, that's a key lesson in Anti-Oedipus. I mean, it's in some ways a dated text, but in some ways like a really quite still relevant text. The difference between interest and desire. There's plenty of plenty of people with progressive interests but reactionary forms of desire, and they have some of the most awful politics that you could imagine, not because of what their kind of macro political ideals are, but because of their micro political means, starting points for kind of asserting it. Deleuze has a wonderful little bit in his response to it's his letter to a harsh critic, where he says something like, if you want to talk about high ideals, go to a leftist meeting and try talking about solidarity and friendship in a leftist meeting. Absolutely. Where everyone treats you as an enemy.
Right.
Yeah,
definitely. I absolutely understand it. But like, my point was about like what happened in Iran like last 6 months. I was here. In October I was in Iran. I came back here. There were protests. There was like there were like demonstrations and so on and so forth. But the thing is that, like, I mean, I try to sort of relate to that in my in this question, that I mean, sometimes I see people who analyze the politics of a country like Syria or Iran in
Yeah,
a generously revolutionary way,
yeah,
but sadly they overlook the
yeah,
demographical or geopolitical realities of such countries and their
yeah.
positioning in international relations, where
Oh,
every
right.
political movement can be hijacked and used against those people.
Yeah,
That's I should admit there's a drive behind these questions. I
yeah.
mean, the driving, yeah.
Oh, yeah. They're all subject to reappropriation.
Mm,
Absolutely. I mean, I think you see that in so many of the politics of today. I saw I don't know, is Jon Stewart a figure in where you are? Yeah, I mean, so he being interviewed on CNN for Fareed Zakaria. I mispronounced his name, I'm sure. Um,
right. Yeah, yeah. Farid Zakaria. Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, Fareed. Yeah, thank you. Who is asking him about, well, like that kind of mode that you had in the Daily Show of, like the parody of the news program where you take the clip and you show it and then you comment on it and you make jokes about it, is the same one that Tucker Carlson is using now. What do you think about the way they've stolen your strategy? But I think that happens all the time, I think. Those kinds of appropriations. There's a bit in A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari, at the end of the War Machine Plateau, where they talk about logistics and strategies. It all comes down to logistics and strategies. And part of that involves logistics and strategies by which you try and get your opponent to do something predictable while you also appropriate what made your opponent powerful. All right. You see this all the time. I mean, whether it's from a conservative political party appropriating a left-wing policy, I mean, or vice versa, I suppose. Anything else. I think those things are true, and I think, yeah, what would you say, the larger geopolitical situations of nation states and so forth? Yeah, that all is that all applies, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, there are material I mean, logistics and strategy also involves material realities. There are material realities in every
Right,
situation.
right, right. I mean, still, it's very interesting
Yeah,
topic. Not only interesting, but also very engaging for me.
yeah,
Like, I mean, like what I mean, it was really blatantly remarkable this time that they protested, like that are like understandable protests can be really
yeah,
hijacked and be sold to the right-wing conservatives in
yeah,
Europe,
yeah,
as you call
yeah,
it, appropriated, right?
yeah.
So not on there is a cynicism inherent in capitalism. I quote you,
Mhm.
it continually internalizes what had been the outer limits of its
Right.
productivity, end of quote.
Yeah.
It is able to invent new axioms, as Deleuze says, to turn anything into a commodity and a
Yeah.
source of profit. My question, though a bit abstract, how can we resist this cynicism?
I feel like saying I don't know. I don't know yet.
Perhaps with laughter.
Maybe. I don't think that's I think that's, well, I mean, I think a really wonderful interview to watch if you have the time is Jon Stewart's interview with Rachel Maddow after
Right.
in 2010, after he did this thing called the Rally to Restore Sanity, which came in a few weeks after another rally, and it was a Tea Party rally, the Rally to Restore America, and that his rally, Stewart's rally, ended with this montage of clips from different news stations, which what he said was taken to mean that he was saying that MSNBC, a kind of left wing, center left wing, centrist, some more often, kind of cable news network, was just as bad as Fox News. And I mean, they were accusing him of like creating this false equivalence between the right and the left, which he had this really interesting interview explaining how it wasn't. But he also talked a lot about the role of satire and comedy in politics. And he was very careful to say, like, his relation to politics as a comedian is very limited. And he has this wonderful example. He talks about The Great Dictator, the Charlie Chaplin movie, is an amazing satire that ultimately did nothing to stop Hitler. And so there's a power to it and an impotence to it at the same time. And anybody who's involved in it, anybody who kind of is involved in comedy, or just anybody who knows how to laugh, like, is aware of both of those things. So late in the interview, he talks about the what the comedy can do is it can create a common affect. It's people, you can say something that connects with people, and they all realize that there's been this kind of inchoate feeling they have. Oftentimes that something's wrong. They've never been able to really put it into words, and that they can come to see that they're not alone in that, that this is a real feeling, and that it's the beginning maybe of a political action, but it isn't political action. So laughing, is important as a precondition maybe for a certain kind of politics, but it's not the same thing as the politics. It's political without being a politics. Right. So yeah, I mean, in part of that, and then you said I don't know, because I mean, the very last thing that I taught this term to my master's students was Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism.
Right.
So I mean, it was pretty hopeless. The description from that book is pretty hopeless. I'm not sure a Marxist super nanny can save us either. But that's the essay question I'm giving them. If you know Fisher's book,
right?
Yeah. I think whatever it would be, let's take the hopeful posture that there is a way of fighting it. It would involve a politics that works on a lot of levels. So comedy could be one of them, and real political action. I mean, I don't think it's just because it's in the news, but I think, climate change and Extinction Rebellion are certainly like one of where the battle line, a big portion of where the battle lines are drawn on that. I mean, some level of real politics is going to be needed.
Right.
That's just one example. There's so many other examples of, where this battle needs to be fought. But it'll be it'll be on all of these different levels.
Definitely.
Right.
I have two questions left for you, so I try to make it shorter. So one of them is starts with a quote. Revolutionaries often forget or do not like to recognize that one wants and makes revolution out of desire, not duty. End of quote from Deleuze. So it's very interesting to me, again, because always when I see that, again, I know it's a bit generalized what I'm telling, but when I see that countries of North support a demonstration or a protest in the South, I sense that the desire is going to be replaced by duty.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that as if, like, the desire to have a revolution in a country, the desire to, like what you talked about in terms of Shah, dethroning Shah, like the interview with Foucault. It is something for me absolutely different from the demand here that we want Iranian people to liberate themselves. It's your duty. It's a moral. It's a calling. To get rid of them, to get rid of these Muslims. Like this, they are two different things. And I just wanted to use this quote in that regard.
Oh yes, no, I can see that. I know that what you were just saying, which reminded me of the 2003 Iraq invasion, right? Well, we've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein for you. Now you can just go and have your democracy.
Right.
I think so sorry, you're saying, does the desire become duty? I see. So you're saying, like, people from the outside who are kind of looking at this and say, well, it's your duty to do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Although they started without having this duty in mind. They started
Right.
with their desires, with their bodies.
Right. And you say, I see. And so what you're saying is from the position of you're not in Iran, for example, that it's kind of being imposed upon them as a duty that they do this from
Definitely.
the West. Yeah, I can see that being a very irritating thing as well. And I mean, duty is a different form of desire, isn't it? And it's probably not a very useful one. I suppose it could be useful. And it depends on how.
Yeah, but it can be
shaped.
very homogenizing form of desire, right?
Yeah, I think that is true. That's definitely true. Because if you're saying that it's presented as kind of a moral duty to,
right?
Are you saying it's a moral duty to become more like us?
Yeah, I mean, like not on let's
moral duty
to
become more of a liberal democratic.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or just let's forget about Iran or any country. Let's think of our refugee example, the refugees here, and she might desire herself to act like Europeans. But if it is your duty to assimilate, it's another story.
Yeah. No.
You know.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, yeah, and that's a well, that's another figure of. I mean, I'll use in those terms, those Nietzsche terms. That's another figure of ressentiment, that you would want other people to be like you. I think that is that's still strongly. I can see how you'd find that strongly prevalent. I can see exactly what you mean. Yeah. It's again, well, I mean, in a way, that's a sign of how much work needs to be done. And I'm not. I almost feel like I don't know how to advise on that. I live in a really multicultural city, which I think, if I read it correctly, is London is now only 54% white, according to some recent statistic, and it is very multicultural. And sometimes that works. I really do believe sometimes that does work, and lots of times it doesn't work at all. I come from a country which I sometimes joke. It is a joke. It's meant humorously. America is a very diverse country, but everyone kind of speaks with the same accent, with the same smile. It's a strangely conformist society. I mean, it isn't in many ways too. It's a very diverse society, but you can kind of see there is a real melting pot ideology that also is at work in it, amidst all and rubs against all the ways in which the country is so different, and the people in the country are so different. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that needs to be. There's a lot of work. Again, it's the amount of work that needs to be done. I was thinking, this came to me because I wasn't sure what this interview would be like, and I don't know how this came to me, but it was a little bit before the interview began. I was recalling my very first academic conference I went to as still a master's student, when I was doing my master's in the UK, but I was back in America, and it was a conference at Yale University called Democracy and Difference. Salah Ben Habib and Tom McCarthy had set it up, and Habermas was there. I heard Habermas speak. A lot of other really, really prominent people. Richard Rorty was there. Richard Bernstein was there. William Connolly was there. Chantal Mouffe, Bonnie Honig, many, many others. And a guy, Ben Barber, was there as well, a kind of Rousseau scholar, if I remember correctly. Originally, he wrote a book called Strong Democracy many years ago, about kind of community, kind of based, kind of democratic politics. And he hated postmodern. He hadn't anything French. He hadn't anything postmodern. It was constantly like, mouthing off about it. Even though there were almost nobody there who was a postmodernist or post-structuralist in any way, shape, or form. But it's 1993, so it was after Yugoslavia had broken up.
Right.
Yeah. So the conflict was going on there. And somebody said, I'm pretty sure in response to Barber, like, what's the point of all of this postmodern identity critique? And somebody said, do you think that what's going on in the former Yugoslavia is a result of people being too attached to their historically contingent collective identities, or that they're not attached enough to them?
Interesting.
And, if we were a little bit less attached to them, we might be a bit more pluralist.
Absolutely.
But again,
right.
yeah. And there's so many forces and so many reasons, I suppose, to kind of to try and push that are pushing the other way. But I think that's
right. Interesting. I see your point. So my last question, Nathan, is
okay.
The influence of, I suppose you're a father and also a teacher, so the influence of Deleuze.
Oh, you might have heard in the background.
No, I saw something. No. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
I mean, like the influence of Deleuze in teaching students, and being a father. I mean, as a way of life.
Oh, does this? I feel it does. One of the nicest compliments I got, I gave my inaugural lecture at Royal Holloway, and a really important friend and mentor of mine, Sue Golding, was the respondent, the person who gives thanks, or forget what exactly they call the person who responds to the inaugural. She said, the thing is that Nathan, what he says about these things, he really also tries to live his life. He really does live his life this way. So yeah, does it influence me? Yeah, I think so. I hope so. How does it influence me?
Especially as a teacher, I'm curious.
I think, how does it influence me? One of the things I learned from William Connolly, studying from him, was to always pitch the ideas as high a level as you can. It doesn't mean every student can keep up with it, but you kind of grade accordingly. You don't have to grade people so that they fail if they don't figure it out. So you try and kind of pitch to the most advanced people while also kind of, not compensating, that's not the right word, but being, not being so dogmatic that they all repeat it back to you. And I think that is actually really important. I think you do, I think I teach, I'd like to think that I present and teach quite rigorously what these thinkers are doing, without trying to say that they're masters that you should all listen to. I'm I'm really poor as a disciplinarian, I think, in my classroom. Maybe with my family life as well. I feel like as a parent, this became very clear to me very early on with my first child, my son. You think that when you're a parent that you're going to stratify your child, you're going to train them, you're going to raise them, and they do the tables are really quickly turned on you. You're the one who gets stratified by them. And I don't know if that's because I'm a Deleuzian and I'm just no good at stratifying, or I'm a Foucauldian, I'm no good at disciplining, but I get disciplined instead. The power relations definitely get reversed when you're a parent. You become much more helpless than you thought you were at the starting point of the relationship. I suppose those reflections are at work when I'm parenting or teaching.
Interesting. So Nathan, thank you very much for this generous possibility